The auction house smelled of smoke and perfume, and something underneath both that Maren Voss had learned to recognize as fear. Thousands of alien nobles filled the coliseum seats, their scaled faces glowing under floating lanterns, their voices a low hum of amusement as guards dragged the next lot onto the stone platform. She did not resist. She never resisted. Her wrists were bound in chains forged from a metal the Kroven called unbreakable, and her knees hit the cold stone hard enough to bruise, and still her face stayed calm, almost bored. The way a woman looks when she has already lived through the worst thing that can happen to her and found out it did not kill her. The auctioneer, a tall reptilian creature with a voice like grinding rocks, gestured toward her with open contempt. Lot 227. Human, weak spine, no augments, no combat record on file. Starting bid, 1 credit. Laughter rippled through the crowd. Someone near the back shouted the bid as a joke, and more laughter followed, and for a moment the entire Coliseum seemed to forget she was even a person and not simply a punchline wearing skin. Maren lifted her eyes and looked at the crowd, slow and unhurried. The way someone looks at a room they have already memorized every exit of. Then she raised her hand, not to surrender, not to beg. She pointed one finger, steady as stone, directly at the auctioneer's throat, and somewhere in the back rose a single Kroven nobleman went very still, because he had spent 40 years reading body language across a dozen species, and hers did not match anything in his training. In 9 seconds, this entire auction house would be dead, and she had not even stood up yet. But nobody in that room knew that yet. Nobody knew who she really was. To understand how a chained slave became the most dangerous being in that Coliseum, you have to go back 6 years to the day humanity supposedly lost the war. The Kroven Empire ruled 900 star systems through a doctrine older than most human civilizations, a caste system built entirely on something they called combat value, a cold mathematical ranking of every species in the galaxy by strength, technology, and battlefield history. Humanity had been cataloged after first contact as Tier 9, non-threat biomass, a designation given after Earth's military was crushed in 11 days of orbital bombardment and ground invasion, so overwhelming that surrender had seemed like the only rational choice. Since that day, humans have been harvested quietly across the Empire as slave labor, cheap, obedient, disposable, useful for menial work and occasional entertainment, never questioned, never feared. Nobody in the Empire ever stopped to ask why humanity had folded so fast, so completely, with almost no resistance in the final days. That question sat buried under 20 years of assumed superiority, and was about to become the most important question in Kroven history. Maren Voss had been a combat medic once, an American who had pulled wounded soldiers out of burning wreckage during the invasion, who had watched Earth's official surrender broadcast from inside a bunker and felt something break in her chest that never fully healed. She had been captured 3 weeks later, cataloged, sold, and resold across 4 systems over 6 years, ending up in a household of Kroven noble named Lord Threx's Van, a collector of exotic curiosities who prized rare specimens the way other nobles prize weapons or art. He had purchased her not because she was valuable, but because of a rumor, quiet and unofficial, whispered among slave traders who dealt in human stock, that a small number of humans bought in the final days of the war had simply vanished from every official record afterward, as if they had never existed at all. Van suspected Earth had not lost that war. He suspected Earth had withdrawn, deliberately, strategically, the way a predator retreats into shadow to study its prey before striking. And he suspected the quiet woman kneeling in his household, the one who never raised her voice, who smiled faintly at cruelty as though counting something only she could see, might be one of the ones who vanished on purpose. Maren said nothing to confirm or deny it. She simply did her work, watched every door, memorized every guard rotation, and waited, because that was the one thing the Kroven Empire had never learned to measure in any species, the terrifying patience of species that had already decided exactly when it would strike back. Lord Threx's Van's estate sat on a cliff above a purple sea, a palace of black stone and glass towers built to remind every visitor of his family's old military conquests, though Van himself had never fought a single battle in his life. He was a collector, not a warrior, and everyone in Kroven high society knew it, which was precisely why he needed Maren Voss. A human slave who behaved like nothing on record was worth more to his reputation than any weapon or jewel, and Van intended to parade that value in front of every rival noble who had ever mocked him for being soft. He watched her now from the balcony above the training yard, arms folded, studying the way she scrubbed the stone floor with mechanical precision, never rushing, never slowing, every motion identical to the last, as though her body had been trained somewhere far more disciplined than any slave pen. It unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. Real slaves broke in visible ways, through trembling hands or hollow eyes, or the particular silence of someone who had given up. Maren's silence felt different. It felt chosen. Down in the yard, a Kroven enforcer named Desk leaned against the wall, arms crossed, watching her with open suspicion. Desk had served in 3 border conflicts before retiring into palace security, and he trusted his instincts more than any official threat rating. Something about the human bothered him, though he could not name it. Only that she moved like someone who had once been trained to move, and slaves did not move that way unless someone had taught them to. He said nothing to Van about it yet, because accusing a Tier 9 species of hidden competence would make him sound paranoid in front of the entire household, and Desk valued his dignity too much for that. But he started watching her more closely after the incident with the plasma cutter. It happened during routine maintenance, a piece of equipment Maren had never operated before, according to her file. The device sparked once, twice, and a technician cursed under his breath as the calibration display flickered red. Maren, without looking up from her work nearby, said quietly that the secondary coil would overheat in 4 seconds. The technician laughed it off until 3 seconds later the coil overheated exactly as she said, and the room went very quiet, and Desk, watching from the doorway, felt something cold settle in his stomach. Van began showing her off at gatherings after that, calling her his harmless little curiosity, presenting her at a banquet where nobles draped in ceremonial armor sipped fermented wine and mocked the idea that humans could ever be anything more than servants. Van asked her, half as a joke, half as a test, to recite Kroven battle law, expecting stammering ignorance. Instead, Maren recited 3 entire sections flawlessly, in perfect formal dialect, her voice calm and even, and the laughter in the room died into an uncomfortable silence that lasted far longer than anyone was willing to admit afterward. Other slaves in the household began whispering about her. Quiet rumors passed between scrubbing duties and meal preparation, saying she marked the days on the wall of her sleeping quarters, small, careful scratches nobody else understood. They assumed it was a calendar, a broken woman counting time the way prisoners sometimes did to hold on to sanity. But the marks were not a calendar. They followed patterns too precise for simple counting, clusters and gaps that meant nothing to anyone who did not already know what they represented, coordinates disguised as despair. Then came the night a resistance signal was intercepted deep in the palace's communication network, a strange repeating pulse that Kroven intelligence officers could not decode no matter how many cipher algorithms they threw against it, because it was not encrypted in any language the Empire had ever cataloged. It was old-world Morse code, a human system centuries out of date, invisible to a civilization that had never bothered studying a species it considered beneath serious threat analysis. Not long after, a single object was smuggled to Maren through the household's cleaning staff, passed hand to hand in silence, wrapped in a scrap of cloth, a rusted metal dog tag, the kind soldiers once wore into battle on Earth. Maren did not react when it reached her palm. She did not gasp, did not cry, did not even look around to see who had delivered it. She simply closed her fists around it, slow and deliberate, and for the first time in 6 years, something behind her eyes shifted, quiet and certain, like a countdown finally beginning to move. The night the dog tag reached her hand, Maren did not sleep. She lay on the thin mat in her sleeping quarters, chain looped loosely around her ankle out of habit more than restraint, and stared at the ceiling while her fingers turned the rusted metal over and over in the dark. 6 years of silence had built to this single object, and now that it had finally arrived, she felt something she had not allowed herself to feel since the surrender broadcast. Not hope, exactly. Something colder and steadier than hope. Confirmation. Somewhere out there, Commander Alan Reyes was still alive, still running the network, still counting the same days she had been counting on that wall, and the tag in her palm meant the signal had finally reached the right hands. She did not sleep, but she also did not celebrate. There was still work to do before anything could move. Lord Van summoned her the next morning to his private study, a room lined with trophies from cultures he had never fought and rarely understood, each one purchased rather than earned. He did not offer her a chair. He simply studied her the way he studied everything he collected, searching for flaw that would explain the price. "Tell me something," he said, his voice quieter than his usual public performance. "When your species surrendered, how many days did the war actually last?" Maren answered without hesitation. 11 days, my lord." Van nodded slowly, watching her face for any crack in composure. 11 days is remarkably fast for a species that supposedly fought back at all. Almost too fast. Almost efficient. Maren said nothing, and her silence told him more than any answer could have. Van leaned forward, elbows on the desk, and asked a question he had been circling for months without daring to say aloud. Did Earth lose that war, or did Earth decide to stop fighting it? The air in the room went very still. Maren's expression did not change, but something in her stillness sharpened, like a blade being drawn without sound. "My lord," she said carefully, "that is a dangerous question to ask in this empire." Van smiled, though there was no humor in it. "That is exactly why I am asking it to you, and not to my council." He stood, walked to the window overlooking the purple sea, and spoke without turning around. "I have heard rumors for years about humans purchased during the final days of the invasion who vanished from every trade record afterward. No resale, no death certificate, nothing. Do you know anything about that, Maren?" She let the silence stretch just long enough to be believable, then answered in the same calm, even voice she always used. "I know that slaves disappear all the time, my lord. Records are often incomplete." Van turned to face her, and for the first time she saw something other than curiosity in his eyes. Fear, small and quiet. The fear of a man who suspected he had bought something far more dangerous than he understood. That night, deep in the palace's lower levels, Des conducted an unauthorized search of the human servants' quarters, driven by an instinct he could no longer ignore. He found the scratches on Maren's wall exactly where the rumors said they would be, and unlike the other guards who dismissed them as meaningless, Des brought a measuring tool and mapped the pattern onto a data slate. What he found sent ice through his veins. The marks were not random. They formed a repeating structure that matched orbital coordinates, dozens of them, scattered across systems the Empire had never bothered patrolling because they registered as dead space, empty, worthless, unwatched. Desk sat alone in the dark server room long after the household had gone quiet, staring at the pattern, piecing together a truth too enormous to say out loud yet. These were not the coordinates of a broken woman marking days in despair. These were rendezvous points, military rendezvous points, plotted with precision that belonged to a trained intelligence operative, not a Tier 9 slave with no combat record. He thought of every human he had ever dismissed as harmless labor across a dozen palaces and outposts, and for the first time in his long career, Desk felt something he had never expected to feel toward humanity. Not contempt, not pity, something closer to dread, the quiet dawning realization that an entire empire may have spent 20 years measuring the wrong thing, and that somewhere in the dead space between the stars, a countdown older than anyone in that palace understood was finally, silently, reaching its end. Desk did not sleep that night either. He sat with the data slate glowing in his hands, the map coordinates burning into his memory, and ran every possible explanation through his mind before finally admitting the only one that made sense. This was not superstition. This was not a broken slave counting days to survive captivity. This was a network, and if his instincts were right, Maren Voss was only one piece of something far larger, something the Empire had never bothered to look for, because it had already decided humans were beneath the effort. He almost went to Lord Van that night. He almost reported everything, the pattern, the rendezvous points, the Morse code signal buried in the palace's communication logs weeks earlier. But something stopped him, a cold professional caution honed over 3 border conflicts, the same instinct that told him a threat this quiet, and this patient would not simply surrender if cornered. If he was wrong, he would look paranoid in front of the entire household. If he was right, moving too soon might trigger something no one in that palace was prepared for. So instead, Desk did what any good soldier does when facing an enemy he does not yet understand. He watched and he waited. and he began quietly reviewing every human purchase record in Kroven territory over the past 6 years, searching for a pattern across systems instead of just within one palace. What he found over the following days made his blood run cold. Across 12 different noble households in 4 different star systems, there were human slaves who matched an almost identical profile, purchased in the final days of the invasion. No combat record on file. Consistently rated as harmless in every behavioral review, and in at least 6 of those households. Similar wall markings have been reported by suspicious guards and quietly dismissed as prisoner delusion. Des began to understand that he was not looking at one embedded operative. He was looking at a network, deliberately scattered across the Empire, each piece isolated, patient, and silent, waiting for the same signal. Meanwhile, inside the palace, Lord Van's suspicion had curdled into something more dangerous than curiosity. He began pulling old classified archives from his family's private military connections, searching for anything related to the final negotiations before Earth's surrender. Most records were sealed under council authority, locked away from even high-ranking nobles like himself. But Van had spent decades building quiet favors across the Empire's bureaucracy, and eventually one contact, an aging records clerk who owed him a debt from years earlier, sent him a single fragment of a diplomatic transmission log that should never have left the vault. It was dated 3 days before the invasion began. It was an official human transmission addressed to the Kroven ruling council, offering full diplomatic negotiation and peaceful resolution before a single shot had been fired. Van read it twice, then a third time, his hands trembling slightly because the transmission had never been answered. The Empire had received an offer of peace from a species it considered too weak to negotiate with, and instead of responding, the ruling council had launched a full invasion 3 days later, burying the message so completely that not even most of its own nobility knew existed. Van sat alone in his study long into the night, staring at that single fragment of buried history, understanding for the first time that the war he had been taught to see as a swift and righteous conquest had actually been an unprovoked attack against a species that had tried to avoid it entirely. And if that was true, then everything the Empire believed about human weakness, every Tier 9 designation, every casual cruelty inflicted on human slaves across 900 systems, was built on a lie the ruling council had chosen rather than a truth anyone had bothered to verify. He thought of Maren, kneeling silently in his household for 6 years, reciting battle law flawlessly, predicting equipment failures with impossible precision, marking coordinates on a wall that Desk now understood were rendezvous points for a war that had never actually ended, only paused. And Van realized, with a chill that settled deep into his bones, that he was no longer simply the owner of a curious pet. He was standing at the center of a secret that could shatter the Empire's entire foundation, and the woman scrubbing his floors was not waiting to be rescued. She was waiting for the moment she decided the wait was finally over. 3 nights after Van found the buried transmission, he summoned Maren to his study alone, dismissing every guard from the corridor outside, including Desk, who left reluctantly, his hand lingering near his weapon longer than protocol required. When the door sealed shut, Van placed a data fragment on the desk between them without a word. Maren looked at it for a long moment, then lifted her eyes to his, and for the first time in 6 years, she did not lower them. "I think you already know what this is," Van said quietly. Maren said nothing, and her silence was answer enough. Van leaned forward, his voice dropping into something almost desperate. "I am not asking as your owner right now. I am asking as a man who has spent 3 days realizing everything he was taught about his own empire might be a lie built on 20 years of buried paperwork. Tell me the truth, Maren. Did Earth surrender? Or did Earth simply decide to disappear?" Maren studied him for a long moment, weighing something behind her calm expression, some calculation only she understood. Then, slowly, she reached up and closed her fingers around the dog tag, hanging beneath her collar, the one she kept hidden against her skin since the night it was smuggled to her. "My lord," she said, her voice steady and quiet, "Earth did not lose that war. We watched what your council did to species who resisted openly. We watched the bombardments, the occupation fleets, the extermination protocols used on worlds that fought back with everything they had. We understood that open resistance would only get every human being on that planet killed. So we did something your empire never accounted for. We surrendered on purpose, publicly, completely, and we used the 20 years that followed to become something your scanners were never built to detect. Van's breath caught. What do you mean, detect? Maren's expression did not change, but something in her eyes hardened into absolute certainty. Your empire measures threat through weapons, fleet size, augmentation levels, kill counts. You never once measured patience. You never measured a species willing to let its own people suffer in slavery for 6 years, scattered across 900 systems, gathering information, mapping supply routes, memorizing security protocols, waiting for the exact right moment to move all at once. We are not soldiers hiding among your slaves. My lord, we are the whole war, paused, patient, and still counting. Van sat back slowly, the full weight of what he had built in his own household finally settling over him. And that transmission, he said, gesturing weakly at the fragment on the desk. The peace offer your council buried, Maren said, was real. We tried the honest path first. Your empire chose invasion instead. Everything since then, every human sold, every human beaten, every human forced to kneel in auction houses while nobles laughed, has simply been the price we were willing to pay to finish what your ruling council started. Van stared at her, and for the first time he did not see a slave or a curiosity or even a threat. He saw a woman who had spent 6 years absorbing humiliation with the patience of someone playing a game far longer than anyone in that palace understood. And he felt something shift inside him, a crack in 20 years of inherited certainty about what his empire was, and what it had actually done. If what you are telling me is true, he said quietly, then this empire attacked a species that never wanted war, buried the proof, and has spent 2 decades enslaving people who could have ended this conflict from the very beginning. Maren's eyes did not waver. Yes, my lord. And Van, staring at the dog tag glinting faintly in the low light of his study, finally understood that the countdown desk had discovered scratched into a wall was not a fantasy born of desperation. It was real, it was active, and somewhere beyond the dead space the Empire had never bothered patrol, an entire fleet was waiting for a single human hand to close around a rusted piece of metal one final time. The auction house was full again, the same coliseum, the same glowing lanterns, the same crowd of nobles who had gathered not to bid seriously, but to be entertained by the spectacle of a species they considered beneath real consideration. Lord Van sat in his reserved balcony seat, his hands clasped tightly enough that his knuckles had paled. Watching Maren kneel on the platform below in chains he now understood meant nothing at all. He had tried, in the 3 days since their conversation, to find some way to stop what he now believed was coming, some way to warn the council, protect his household, protect himself. But every path led to the same impossible choice: expose the truth and destroy his own empire's foundation, or stay silent and become complicit in a lie that had already cost thousands of lives. He had not decided yet. He would not have to decide much longer. Desk stood near the platform in full guard posture, his weapon steady, his eyes fixed on Maren with the sharp, focused attention of a soldier who finally understood exactly what he was looking at, though even he did not know the full scale of what was about to happen. The auctioneer's voice echoed across the coliseum, mocking, careless, utterly unaware that he was standing 3 meters from the center of the most consequential moment in Kroven history. Lot 227. He called out again, exactly as he had months before. Human, weak spine, no augments, no combat record. Starting bid, 1 credit. Laughter rippled to the crowd exactly as it always did, and somewhere in that laughter, Maren closed her eyes for one final moment, feeling the dog tag warm against her skin, feeling 6 years of patience compress into a single heartbeat. Then she opened her eyes, lifted her head, and raised her hand. Not in surrender. Never in surrender. She pointed one finger at the auctioneer's throat, exactly as she had the very first time the scene played out. Except now, everyone watching would finally understand why. For 3 full seconds, nothing happened, and confusion rippled to the crowd. Nobles murmuring, Desk's weapon rising slightly on instinct, though he was not sure what threat he was responding to. Then the sky above the Coliseum's open dome cracked with sound, a deep resonant thunder that had nothing to do with weather. Every noble in that stadium looked up in time to see the atmosphere itself ripple, cloaking fields collapsing in perfect synchronized sequence as an entire fleet of human dropships decloaked directly above the auction house, silent until that exact moment, invisible for as long as it took Maren to raise her hand. Screaming erupted through the crowd as security forces scrambled toward exits that suddenly seemed too narrow, too slow, too insufficient for the panic spreading through 900 years of assumed superiority. But the ships did not open fire on the crowd. They dropped precisely, surgically, for squads landing directly onto the auction platform itself, forming a defensive perimeter around Maren before a single Kroven guard could even process what was happening. Commander Alan Reyes stepped down from the lead dropship, his boots hitting stone that had, moments earlier, held nothing but chains and cruelty, and his eyes found Maren immediately. 6 years of silence collapsing into a single look between two people who had trusted each other across a distance neither had been able to measure until now. Echo 7, he said quietly, using a designation that meant nothing to anyone else in that coliseum. Confirmed active. Maren rose to her feet for the first time in 6 years without permission from anyone, her chains falling away, not broken by force but simply unlocked, revealing that they had never truly held her at all. Lord Van stood frozen in his balcony seat, watching the moment he had feared and anticipated finally arrive, and in that instant he made the only choice that could save whatever remained of his conscience. He reached for the emergency broadcast control built into every noble balcony, a system meant for announcements during ceremonial events, and instead broadcast a buried transmission fragment directly into the Coliseum's communication network, letting the entire crowd, and every recording device in that stadium, hear the 20-year-old human piece offer his own empire had silently buried before launching an unprovoked invasion. The auction house that had gathered to mock a slave now stood in stunned silence, watching a fleet they never detected, hearing a truth their empire had hidden for 2 decades, finally understanding, far too late, that the countdown had already ended. The Coliseum had gone silent in a way that felt almost physical, a stillness so complete that the only sound left was a low hum of human dropship engines idling above the shattered dome, and the ragged breathing of thousands of nobles who had come to watch a slave auction and instead found themselves witnesses to the unraveling of their own empire's history. Desks stood frozen near the platform, weapons still raised out of habit rather than intention, staring at Maren as she rose fully to her feet, chains pulled at her ankles like something shed rather than broken. He had spent weeks piecing together fragments of a truth too large to hold, and now he stood at the center of its confirmation, and he made no move to stop her. Some instincts, he realized, existed for exactly this moment, to recognize when resistance was no longer wisdom but simple stubborn denial of what had already happened. High Counselor Threemox, watching from a private security feed deep within the Imperial capital, rose from her seat as the buried transmission finished playing across every channel in the Coliseum, her expression carved from 20 years of unshaken authority, now cracking in real time. She understood, faster than most of her peers would, exactly what this moment meant. Not simply the exposure of one buried message, but the collapse of the entire justification her empire had used to enslave a species for 2 decades. She began issuing emergency containment orders within seconds, demanding the broadcast be cut, demanding the fleet be engaged, demanding the narrative be controlled before it spread further. But narratives, once broken open in front of thousands of witnesses holding personal recording devices, do not close again so easily. Down on the platform, Commander Alan Reyes moved with the calm efficiency of a man who had rehearsed this extraction 100 times in simulation and now finally executed in reality. His squads forming a tight perimeter as Maren stepped toward him, unshackled, unhurried. 6 years of careful patience finally spending itself in this single deliberate walk across stone. She did not run. She did not need to. The empire that had called her harmless for 6 years now watched her cross that platform with the unmistakable bearing of someone who had never once been afraid of them, only waiting for the moment fear would finally belong to someone else. Lord Van remained in his balcony seat, his hand still resting on the broadcast control. He had just used to detonate his own empire's carefully constructed lie, and he watched Maren pause at the edge of the platform, looking up at him with an expression that held no gratitude, no forgiveness, simply quiet acknowledgement of a debt now settled. He had not saved her. She had never needed saving. But he had chosen, in the final moment available to him, to stand on the side of truth rather than comfortable silence, and that choice would follow him through everything that came next, through council inquiries and public outrage, and the slow, painful fracturing of an empire built on a lie he had helped expose. Maren did not kill that day. The human forces disabled security systems, secured the platform, and extracted every operative present in that sector with the same surgical precision that had defined their entire 6-year campaign. Because the mission had never been vengeance. It had been proof. Proof that humanity had not lost anything. Proof that patience given enough time could dismantle an empire more thoroughly than any war ever could. Before she boarded the final dropship, Maren turned back toward the stunned crowd still frozen in their seats, and she spoke, not loudly, but clearly enough that every recording device in that coliseum captured every word. "You were told we surrendered," she said. "We were just waiting for the right moment to answer." Then she stepped into the ship, and the fleet ascended to the broken dome, cloaking fields reactivating as smoothly as they had dropped, leaving behind a coliseum full of nobles who would spend the rest of their lives explaining to their children what they had witnessed that day. In the weeks that followed, the buried transmission spread across allied worlds faster than any council censorship effort could contain, and the Kroven Empire fractured into the kind of political chaos that comes not from external invasion, but from the collapse of a story a civilization had told itself for 20 years. Earth did not conquer anyone. It did not need to. It simply revealed the truth, calmly, precisely, exactly as Maren had done when she removed her own slave collar with her own hands and set it down on the auctioneer's empty podium before walking out of that coliseum under no one's permission but her own. Somewhere far from that shattered dome, on a quiet world the Empire had never bothered to scan, humanity continued exactly as it always had, patient, watching, ready. They had spent 20 years asking how strong humans were. They should have asked how patient.